In this presentation, I'm going to talk about what theories and hypotheses are in general terms and in how they kind of factor into what we do in international relations. Now, theories, right, are about explaining the world. And, you know, in a lot of ways, what we do is we are trying to tell stories, right? And uh, in, we're kind of doing we're kind of engaged in scientific storytelling, as I say. And what is a story except a chain of causally linked events, right? And a story has a beginning, it introduces elements to it, and it has an end. And the story has to have all the steps that lead to the ending. And a good story is going to kind of strip out all extraneous facts and events and focus on the things that affect the ending and that are important to it. And so that is part of what theory, that is all part of scientific storytelling. And we mainly do our storytelling through theories. And a theory is an explanation of a phenomenon based on underlying or unobserved phenomena or phenomenon, and i.e. the story. In other words, we try to explain what we see in the world in terms of other things in the world that have an effect on it, right? And that's these causally linked events. So that's what a theory is, an explanation. A theory tells us what causes things. Very important to keep that in mind at all times. Okay, I'm talking about, theories explaining one, they explain one phenomena in terms of another. And these are the variables, right? And a variable is a category of phenomena that can be, consistently, it can be measured and it can be observed and can take different values, right? And so we can talk about winning and losing, right? There's an outcome. If you talk about sports, right? Well, there's the team, the home team, and the visiting team, and those are categories, and they change, right? Because what's in that category at any given event or instance changes. And you could say, well, there's win and lose, right? There's or there's the score. These are things that they vary, right? That's what we call them, variables. Now the thing is, a theory is going to talk about a dependent variable. It's going to explain something, right? That is typically called the dependent variable. And it doesn't make sense to call it I know, but that's because we're saying what that variable is, what happens in that depends on these other variables, right? We're going to say, look, here, this is kind of it's not exactly an outcome, but it can be, right? Let's just say it's an outcome. The outcome of who wins the game depends on, and then the story, right? This is our explanation for why you win or lose the game, right? So the thing we're trying to explain is the dependent variable. Just get that in your head and stamp it there. This is very important. Okay. The other thing we have the variables that explain it, and these can be called they're most typically called independent variables, especially when you do empirical research. They're also, when talking about theories, called explanatory variables, and these are the things that are the causal factor in an explanation. So when we have a theory, we're saying that some things cause another, that there's this one thing we want to explain. That's the dependent variable. And then we say, okay, here are the things or the thing that we think affects that, right? That's the explanatory variable. When we do empirical testing, we'll call it an independent variable, okay? So these are two, and this is a very big deal, right? The concept of variables, the concept that we are trying to talk about how one group of things one category of things, whether it be economic growth, human rights, democratization. There's a thing this thing we're trying to explain is affected by other things, right? Those are the explanatory variables, the independent variables, the causes, right? And we're trying to have explanations and tell stories where these things, the explanatory variables affect the dependent variables. Now, theories, to try to concretize a little bit. Theories are explanations, and we're going to hit you with a whole bunch of these grandiose theories, realism and neorealism and neoliberal institutionalism and constructivism, and these are very broad theories that explain the main things we're interested in IR. Realism explains war, right? And when the world is more likely to have war or not. And okay, great. However, there are little theories, and basically any explanation, right? Any causal explanation, anything that says, look, this outcome is affected by these factors, is a theory. Right? A theory is an explanation. Get it out of your head that a theory is a guess or in some way questionable, because there is this, oh, that's just a theory, right? There's this idea that if you have a theory, it means you don't know it. Get that out of your head. That's not part of science. Science, even when something's confirmed, right? It's still open. It's still a theory. It may have a lot of support, but it's still, we never prove a theory. And I'll get into that why in just a second. Now, by way of demystifying it, here, like, I like dogs, right? As I record this, I can look over the top of literally look over the top of my laptop and see two dogs sleeping on the guest room bed. And yeah, that's where I'm recording this. I like dogs. I'm also old, so I remember Cesar Millan and Victoria Stilwell. They're from, a while back. Their popularity was much higher, maybe 10 years ago, but they had two different explanations for why dogs act the way they are, right? Now that sentence probably isn't scary, and that sentence probably makes sense to you. And that sentence is equivalent to saying they each had a different theory explaining dog behavior, or they had a different theory to explain their dependent variable, right? Well, that sentences get more abstract perhaps, but certainly more esoteric. But that's exactly what's going on there. Cesar Millan had this dominance theory, right? He said, look, dogs behave the way they do because they are, it's ingrained in them to have a pack mentality, and that they have a place in the pack. And, if you want to affect their behavior, you need to be the leader of the pack, right? And so you need to establish dominance over the dog, establish your position as superior, and then the dog will do what you want. And that's basically what he talks about and how he works. Victoria Stilwell had a positive reinforcement thing. She did not buy into the dominance theory. She said, no, dogs respond to, incentives and to pleasure and to, basically you reward the good behavior and you don't reward the bad behavior, and the dog will behave the way you want them. And two different explanations for the same thing, right? The thing they're explaining is the behavior of the dog, and that's the dependent variable, right? That's what they're trying to explain. And it's always important to keep in mind what you're trying to explain, right? Because sometimes, people will get causality backwards, or they will, go sideways of it. They won't, they'll talk about a lot of factors and you're not really sure which thing they're trying to explain. These guys are very clearly trying to explain the dog behavior, but they have two different explanatory variables or independent variables. and they are making these predictions. And what I like about this too is that, you know, they're both talking about some process underneath the surface, something we don't quite observe, the dominance. And, you know, we can observe aspects of dominance and pack behavior, but we can't observe what's going on in the dog's head, right? And same thing with reward and such. You know, we can't perfectly observe. We can observe aspects of it, but we can't really get in and open the dog's head and see what's going on in there. And so we are at some level having to guess about what the cause and effect relationships are at play. And that's where theories come in and are most valuable, right? So we have these two different explanations. And so in international relations, we're not going to talk about dogs, but we're going to talk about a lot of other phenomena, whether it be, like I say, whether it be terrorism or economic growth or poverty, or there'll be something you want to explain, right? And that's largely the choice of the researcher. You know, I'm trying to explain this today, right? And there'll be a lot of explanations that you will be exposed to throughout the program, and you need to keep track of them. And they are theories. We're going to have a lot of theories about how independent or explanatory variables affect dependent variables, the things we're interested in explaining. And those are going to be, you know, that's a lot that in a lot of ways forms our basic understanding of the world, right? These are the answers to the questions of why things happen, what's going on, right? And however, we do have multiple ones. And I mean, here's an important point. You know, both Milan and Stilwell train dogs. It works. Both their ideas work. And so more than one causal process can be at play in events that we see in the world. And, you know, so we always have to keep that in mind. And there's this idea of rival hypotheses, right? That you're going to find that there are going to be a lot of different hypotheses. Rival theories. We'll get to hypotheses. There are a lot of different rival theories out there. And every situation you're going to have, you know, for terrorism, there'll be rival theories explaining why terrorism occurs. And they may hold water in some cases and others. And, you know, that's the world we're going to live in, right? And empirical research is about trying to sort out which of these are best supported, which of these do the best job. But okay, just keep this in mind. Theories are explanations. Now, hypotheses. I was tripping myself up talking about it before. Hypotheses, these are testable statements. These are observable things. That's the key thing. That's what a hypothesis is. A hypothesis is always going to be tied to an explanation, a theory, right? So when Cesar Millan says, hey, the way you've got to, you know, if you want to keep your dog from, you know, pulling on the leash while you're walking, you've got to assert your dominance. You've got to act in certain ways. And he'll say, look, you know, don't let the dog go out the door before you. And, you know, he'll have a list of things you do. And he says, look, if you do that, then the dog's behavior is going to change, right? So when he says, don't let the dog go out in front of you, you know, through the door before you, right? Let's just take that. That's the independent variable. And the dependent variable is the dog will be more docile, right? Less aggressive when you're on your walk. And that, you know, there's no why in there, right? We're missing the whole explanation of the dominance, but it is observable, right? We can go and say, okay, if I do this, then does that happen? And we can experiment, right? And we can get in there and generate data and figure out. And in fact, that's what you're doing when you're training your dog, right? It's a treatment more, but you see what I'm saying? Is there will be an observable phenomena here. And that's what hypotheses are, right? Hypotheses are, and you know, here I say testable, right? Because, well, we can only test something if we observe it. And it's, you know, a testable statement about the empirical relationship between cause and effect, right? Something we should be able to observe if the story we've told is true, right? If dominance is correct, then going out the door before your dog should have an effect on the behavior, right? Because you're asserting dominance. Similarly, Victoria Stilwell might say, all right, when the dog does something you like, you give it a treat, right? And so when the dog is behaving properly, either you give it a treat or you talk soothingly to it, and boom. Rival explanation, different hypothesis. And when I talk about testing, a lot of what science is about is you get rival theories that generate rival hypotheses. You go and test these through experimentation or observation or whatever, and then you compare and you say, okay, which theory is better supported, right? So the relationship of hypotheses is that, they're predictive, and in fact, they're valuable, not just for finding out whether the theory is right, but that, the hypothesis is often, hey, this is what you need to do, right? Don't let the dog go out before you, right? If you don't want it to pull, assert control at the door. And that's just one thing, but, that makes it useful, right? If the explanation doesn't tell you about the world, if a theory can't predict the world and tell you, hey, when one thing changes, another thing's going to happen, it's not very useful now, is it? And so a hypothesis should be predictive, and all theories, good theories, should produce predictions about the world, and that's what we want, right? We want to be able to say, if we have a theory about why terrorism occurs, we should have a prediction, be able to predict that terrorism is more likely in some circumstances than others, right? Or else that theory is not really useful. And they got to be testable, right? And what do I mean testable? We have to be able to observe them. We have to be able to answer them through observation, experimentation, but through through looking at the existing world. And so call it observation if you want, right? But this is empirical testing. And so that's the key thing, that everything in a hypothesis can be observed in the world. Let me give you an example from IR, enough of this dog training stuff. Protectionism, right? A lot of protectionist theory goes to this idea, hey, exports support jobs in the economy. Imports, when we make something and sell it to someone overseas, someone in our economy is employed, and yay. Imports, where we buy something that was made overseas, takes jobs away. It hurts employment in our country, right? This is the story, right? Exports good, imports bad, right? They took our jobs, right? It is a South Park thing. That's a big part of protectionist theory, right? And the thing is, and so we're saying, we're talking about a relationship, what's going on. It's an explanation of jobs coming and going. The impact of your independent variable is exports and imports. The dependent variable is employment. And this is the story that protectionist theory tells you. Okay, that generates a hypothesis, right? Well, if exports support jobs and imports take them away, then the trade deficit, if you have a trade surplus where you're exporting more than you're importing, that should make more jobs. When you have a trade deficit, that should take jobs away. And, in fact, we would expect the bigger the trade deficit, the worse the employment. Okay, so that generates a hypothesis that there is a positive relationship between the U.S. trade deficit and the U.S. unemployment. We're having to get down to brass tacks. We're having to say, we're going to look at U.S. data here. You could look at all countries, right? But, when we start talking hypotheses, we are now talking observing the world and that sort of thing. So here we have a hypothesis. There's a positive relationship between U.S. trade deficit, U.S. unemployment. And okay, maybe we could test that. Hey, and we, when you take 6601, you'll find that there's a lot of ways to do a sophisticated test of this through regression analysis, et cetera, et cetera. But hey, let's just go look at the data. Here you got it, right? Trade deficit is a percentage of GDP for the United States, and it only goes through the Great Recession. And I don't feel like updating it for an example, but trade deficit or percentage of GDP versus unemployment rate. And when you look at that chart, it doesn't, some places as the trade deficit goes up, right? Unemployment goes up. Other places it goes down, especially when you get to the Great Recession, right? And so the thing is that there isn't that strong of a relationship. And in fact, the trade deficit, as it went up, especially in the 90s, it didn't, unemployment actually dropped. And so I can tell you, if you do a statistical test, there is no relationship here, right, between these two variables. So that hypothesis fails. And that's the sort of thing we do, right? This is what we do in life as scholars, is you have a hypothesis. I mean, you have a theory that tells a story, and it sounds reasonable, right? But then you say, all right, does it hold water? And so you generate a hypothesis of it. And there's a lot of other hypotheses you could have gotten out of that, right? I just came up with one. And here's the data. We can observe it. And the point is, do you see that you can't observe the jobs thing so much? It's hard to observe that, but you can observe certain facts, right? And so those relationships that are directly observable are the things we call hypotheses, and they're the things we look at. And you could get multiple hypotheses out of the protectionist theory and look at them and see how the support goes. Also, you can have rival explanations, and there are rival explanations of trade and employment that you could get out there, and you could also test them. But this is the whole point of this is we have theories. We have these explanatory stories. And then we have hypotheses, which are the predictions that come from them. And that they are the things we test to figure out whether the story holds water. And that is a very important part of the scientific approach to international relations and politics. That's what makes this a social science, right, as opposed to humanities. So I hope this explanation is useful and that you're able to keep these differences in mind as we go forward.